Welcome back to Wartime Heroes. This channel is about extraordinary people who faced impossible choices and emerged as legends. Tonight's story isn't about someone who wanted glory. It's not about a man who sought fame. It's not even about someone who believed in war. It's about a mountain boy from Tennessee who became the most decorated soldier of World War I, not because he loved fighting, but because he loved his fellow man. When his sergeant fell beside him and machine gun fire tore through his unit, he didn't retreat. He didn't surrender. He picked up that rifle and did something that military historians still call impossible. If you believe courage comes from the most unexpected places, hit that like button. If you think this story needs to be heard, make sure to subscribe, because this is the kind of legend that changes how you see what one person can do when everything depends on them. His name was Alvin York, and before he became a hero, he was something else entirely. A troublemaker, a drinker, a man who solved problems with his fists and lived like tomorrow didn't matter. But somewhere between the backwoods of Tennessee and the trenches of France, something transformed him. Not just into a soldier, but into a man who would single-handedly capture 132 German prisoners and silence 35 machine gun nests in one morning. The German high command would call it impossible. The American military would call it legendary, but Alvin York would call it something else. He'd call it doing what needed to be done. Before we dive into that moment that changed history, you need to understand where he came from. Because heroes aren't born in palaces. They're forged in places where survival is earned every single day. The year was 1887. Pall Mall, Tennessee was nothing more than a collection of wooden cabins scattered across the Cumberland Mountains. No electricity, no running water, no easy life. Just families scratching out an existence from rocky soil and hoping winter wouldn't be too harsh. Into this world came Alvin York, third of 11 children born to William and Mary York. His father was a blacksmith when work was available and a farmer when it wasn't. His mother was everything else: cook, doctor, teacher, disciplinarian. She held that family together with prayer, determination, and an iron will that would show up later in her son. Alvin grew up fast. Had to. When you're one of 11 kids and your father dies when you're barely 20, childhood ends abruptly. He became the man of the house overnight, hunting to put food on the table, working whatever jobs he could find, making sure his younger brothers and sisters had what they needed. But the weight of responsibility didn't sit well on young shoulders. Alvin found escape in the bottom of a bottle and trouble in every saloon within riding distance. By his early 20s, Alvin York had earned a reputation, not the kind mothers wanted their daughters to know. He was known for his fists, his drinking, and his temper. Saturday nights meant fights. Sunday mornings meant regret. He'd work all week, then blow his wages on whiskey and gambling. His mother, Mary, would pray for him every night, but prayers seemed to bounce off a man determined to waste his life one bottle at a time. But Mary York didn't give up. She kept praying, kept believing, kept hoping that somewhere inside her wild son was the man God intended him to be. And then something happened that changed everything. The exact details are lost to time, but the result was crystal clear. In 1914, at a revival meeting in a small country church, Alvin York found something stronger than whiskey. He found faith. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was complete. The man who'd been throwing punches on Saturday night was leading church services on Sunday morning. He stopped drinking, stopped fighting, stopped gambling. He traded his reputation as the toughest man in the valley for something more valuable. Respect. Not the kind you earn with your fists, but the kind you earn with your character. Alvin threw himself into church life with the same intensity he'd once reserved for trouble. He became an elder, led singing, taught Sunday school. He courted a local girl named Gracie Williams with the patience of a man who understood that good things were worth waiting for. Life was finally making sense. He had purpose, direction, and peace. The wild boy from the mountains had become a man of God. And then the world exploded, June 1917. The United States entered World War I. President Wilson called for men to serve their country. Draft boards across America began registering every able-bodied man between 21 and 30. Alvin York was 29, single, strong as an ox and accurate with a rifle in ways that bordered on supernatural. He was exactly what the Army needed. But Alvin York was also something else. He was a conscientious objector. Not because he was afraid to fight, but because he believed fighting was wrong. The same faith that had saved him from a life of violence now demanded that he reject violence entirely. When his draft notice arrived, Alvin filled it out honestly. Under the section asking about religious objections to military service, he wrote one word: yes. His local draft board wasn't impressed. They knew Alvin's reputation with a rifle. Every man in Fentress County had heard stories of his shooting, how he could hit a turkey's head at distances that seemed impossible, how he'd won every shooting contest for miles around, how he could put 5 shots through a playing card at 50 yards and not even breathe hard afterward. They needed soldiers, not philosophers. The board denied his request. Alvin York was going to war whether he wanted to or not, but the internal battle was far from over. Alvin appealed the decision. He met with his pastor, studied his Bible, searched his soul for answers. How could a man of God take up arms? How could someone who'd found peace in Christ pick up a rifle to kill other men? These weren't academic questions for Alvin. They cut to the very core of who he'd become. His pastor offered little help. The church elders were divided. Some said a man must defend his country. Others insisted that true faith meant turning the other cheek no matter the cost. Alvin was caught between two absolutes: serve God or serve country. There had to be another way, but he couldn't see it. As his induction date approached, Alvin made peace with his conscience the only way he knew how. He would serve. He would go where the army sent him. But he would trust God to show him the right path when the time came. It was a leap of faith that would define not just his service, but his legacy. October 1917, Camp Gordon, Georgia. Alvin York stepped off the train into a world he'd never imagined. Thousands of men from every corner of America, all learning to be soldiers. The noise was overwhelming. Shouting drill sergeants, marching feet, rifle fire from the practice ranges. For a man who'd grown up in the quiet of mountain mornings, it was like landing on another planet. But if the army expected this Tennessee farm boy to struggle, they were wrong. Alvin York was in the best physical condition of his life. Years of mountain living had given him endurance that left city boys gasping. His natural marksmanship made rifle training almost redundant. What the Army couldn't have predicted was his character. The same qualities that had made him a leader in his church made him a leader among soldiers. He didn't curse, didn't drink, didn't chase women like most of the other recruits. Instead, he wrote letters home to Gracie, read his Bible every night, and quietly earned the respect of men who'd initially mocked his mountain accent and simple faith. There was something about Alvin York that made other soldiers want to follow him, not because he demanded it, but because he deserved it. His commanding officer, Captain Edward Danforth, noticed it first. During training exercises, other soldiers naturally gravitated toward York. When confusion erupted during night maneuvers, men looked to the quiet Tennessee mountaineer for direction. When morale sagged during brutal conditioning marches, York's steady presence kept units moving forward. He didn't seek leadership, but leadership found him anyway. But the contradiction remained. How could a man who refused to kill become an effective soldier? The question haunted Alvin through weeks of bayonet training, grenade throwing, and tactical instruction. Every lesson was designed to make him more efficient at taking human life. Every drill pushed him closer to a moment of truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Captain Danforth saw the conflict eating at his most promising recruit. Late one evening, he called York to his tent for a conversation that would reshape everything. They talked through the night about duty, faith, and the terrible mathematics of war. Danforth didn't try to change York's beliefs. Instead, he helped him see them from a different angle. What if serving meant protecting the innocent? What if taking one life could save a dozen others? What if God had given him these extraordinary skills not to waste in the mountains of Tennessee, but to use when his country needed them most? The captain opened his Bible and read from Ezekiel. When I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, his blood will I require at thine hand. The words hit York like lightning. Maybe his duty wasn't to avoid violence. Maybe it was to use violence righteously when righteous violence was required. Maybe God had been preparing him his entire life for something bigger than he'd ever imagined. By morning, Alvin York had found his answer. He would serve completely. He would train completely, and when the time came, he would fight completely. Not because he loved war, but because he loved the men beside him and the people back home counting on them to return. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. York threw himself into military training with the same intensity he'd once brought to drinking and later to faith. He mastered every weapon they put in his hands. He learned tactics, strategy, and the dozens of small skills that kept soldiers alive in combat. But more importantly, he became the kind of soldier other men trusted with their lives. Spring 1918, the 882nd Division shipped out for France. As their transport ship cut through the Atlantic, York stood at the rail watching the endless water and thinking about home. Gracie's letters were tucked in his jacket pocket. His mother's prayers followed him across the ocean. The mountains of Tennessee felt like another lifetime, but they'd made him who he was. Strong enough for what was coming, faithful enough to see it through. The trenches of the Western Front were hell on earth. Miles of mud, barbed wire, and death that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Men lived underground like animals, fighting for gains measured in yards rather than miles. The smell never left your nostrils. Cordite, mud, decay, and fear mixed into something that clung to everything it touched. York's unit, the 328th Infantry Regiment, was assigned to a quiet sector for their introduction to trench warfare. But quiet was relative on the Western Front. Sniper fire picked off the unwary, artillery barrages came without warning. Poison gas drifted across no man's land on favorable winds. Death was random, sudden, and everywhere, but Alvin York adapted. His mountain instinct served him well in this underground world. He could move silently through communication trenches, could spot enemy movement that others missed, could judge distance and wind with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to shoot not for sport but for survival. The other soldiers began calling him the Mountain Man. But it wasn't mockery. It was respect. Still, nothing had prepared him for the reality of taking human life. The first time came during a night raid. A German soldier stumbled into their trench section, lost and alone. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across 10 feet of mud and darkness. The German was young, maybe 18, with fear in his eyes that matched what York felt in his chest. Training took over. York's rifle spoke once. The German fell, and something inside Alvin York died with him. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross. The boy from Tennessee who'd once refused to harm another human being had become a killer. That night, alone in his dugout, York opened. The weight of it nearly crushed him, his Bible, and searched for answers. He found them in the book of Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to kill, and a time to heal. Maybe this was his time to kill. Maybe healing would come later. The months that followed were a blur of training, patrols, and small engagements. York proved himself again and again. His marksmanship was legendary among the regiment. His courage was unquestioned. His leadership was natural and effective. When sergeants fell, York stepped up. When officers were killed, York kept units together. He was becoming the kind of soldier armies are built around, but he was also changing in ways that worried him. Each kill came easier than the last. Each death affected him less. The gentle mountain boy who'd found God in a country church was disappearing, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. York began to fear what he was becoming almost as much as he feared the enemy. His letters home grew shorter and less frequent. How could he tell Gracie about the things he'd seen and done? How could he explain to his mother that her prayers had turned her son into an instrument of death? The weight of war was crushing the man he'd been, forging him into something new and terrible. October approached. Intelligence reports indicated the Germans were planning something massive, a final offensive designed to break Allied lines before American reinforcements could tip the balance. York's regiment was moved to the Argonne Forest, a strategic position that would bear the full weight of the coming storm. The forest was dark, dense, and ominous. Ancient trees blocked out the sun, creating a twilight world where death lurked behind every trunk. German machine gun nests dotted the landscape like deadly flowers. Snipers owned the high ground. Artillery had turned the forest floor into a moonscape of craters and splintered wood. As York's unit took their positions, he felt something he hadn't experienced since that first night in the trenches. Fear, not of death, but of what he might have to become to survive what was coming. The boy from Pall Mall, Tennessee, was about to face his greatest test, not just of courage or skill, but of soul. October 8th, 1918, dawned gray and cold. Somewhere in the distance, artillery began to thunder. The final chapter of Alvin York's transformation was about to begin. The attack began before sunrise. York's company moved through the Argonne in single file, shadows among shadows, their breath visible in the cold morning air. The plan was simple on paper: break through German lines, capture the Decauville Railroad, cut enemy supply routes. But plans had a way of dying the moment bullets started flying. By dawn, they were deep in enemy territory. Too deep. The forest had swallowed them, and somewhere in the maze of trees and trenches they'd lost contact with the main force. 17 men cut off, surrounded with orders to take objectives designed for an entire battalion. It should have been suicide, but York's squad kept moving. They'd come too far to turn back now. Through thick undergrowth, past abandoned German positions, deeper into the forest where every shadow could hide death. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of boots on wet leaves and the distant rumble of artillery. Then they found them. 35 German machine gun nests arranged in a deadly crossfire pattern. The positions were expertly camouflaged, nearly invisible until you were close enough to count the barrels. This was what had been chewing up Allied advances for weeks. This was the fortress that couldn't be taken. That's the story of Alvin York, from troublemaker to hero, from sinner to legend. A man who proved that courage isn't about wanting to fight. It's about fighting for what matters when everything depends on you. His journey reminds us that heroes aren't born. They're forged in the fires of impossible choices and unwavering faith. Thank you for watching Wartime Heroes. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear what one person can accomplish when they refuse to give up.